Hi, thank you for tuning in and welcome to our second class in this Lomdus 101 series. Today we're going to focus on another principle of Lomdus, another method of thinking that we have in the study of Gemara, Halacha. And for today's class I picked a topic because it's the second class, one which is still very fundamental, very general, can be applied to literally hundreds of places. But I also wanted to pick something that was a little bit more advanced, a little bit more abstract than what we did last time. So I think today's topic, today's class, will be a little bit more intense, but still on a very fundamental and important level. So today we're going to look at the principle of Chiyuv versus Shlilah, or Metzius versus Heder. Basically it means positive versus negative, existence versus lack of existence. And what that means, in simple words, is that we often come across a halacha, a law, or a concept which is double-sided. We have the one side which is the way it should be done, the way it's kosher, and the other side which is the way it shouldn't be done, way that it would be possible. Do it in this way, don't do it in that way. And whenever we have this double-sided halacha, we have to ask the question, which side is the main side and which side is derived, is a result from the other. Is the focus of the halacha, is the focus of the concept that this way is good, this way is kosher, this way is right, this way is proper, and automatically as a result the other way is no good? Or is it the other way around? The focus of the halacha is the negative side. The focus is this is no good, this way is bad, this way would not work, and automatically you need the other way. Maybe another way of putting it is, if we just look at the side which is no good, the side which is pasul, the side which is tamei or not kosher or no good, we can ask, what is the nature of that disqualification? What is the nature of that negative side? Is the issue with the negative side that it's missing the positive element of the positive side, or is the issue the negative itself? There's something inherently wrong with this side which is the cause for making it disqualified or bad. So that's in very general, abstract terms. I think once we get into some of the examples, what we're trying to say here will become a little bit more clear. So, from all of the achronim, from all of the later Torah scholars who talk about this, the person who stands out the most when it comes to this principle is definitely the Harogotchover Gaon, Rabbi Yosef Rosen, who lived between 1858 and 1936. He was the rabbi in the city of Dvinsk, and he wrote his most famous work, the Tzafnas Paneach, his commentary on the Rambam. But the Harogotchover Gaon was known in his generation as one of the greatest minds, and some even say that even not in his generation, in general throughout Jewish history, he stands out as one of the greatest thinkers, original thinkers, a tremendous genius. So this idea here of asking, checking for the positive side versus the negative side is really something which he addresses a lot in his works. And actually today I'm going to take all of the examples straight out of his writings. So we're going to talk about the first example is the idea of Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. There are many halachas, many concepts in Torah where a mitzvah or the halacha, the law, requires the land of Israel. For there to be an obligation even, or for the mitzvah to be able to be fulfilled, we must be in Eretz Yisrael. But if you live outside of Eretz Yisrael, then the mitzvah cannot be performed, or the issue that we're talking about would be pasul, would be disqualified, because we require Eretz Yisrael. And here the Harogotchover asks the question. He says, whenever we have this requirement of needing Eretz Yisrael, and Chutz La'aretz is no good, what's the main component? Is the main component that we require Eretz Yisrael? There's a positive quality to Eretz Yisrael which is required, and automatically, why is Chutz La'aretz disqualified? Because Chutz La'aretz, outside of Israel, we're lacking the positive quality of Israel. So automatically, the Chutz La'aretz wouldn't work because we need the positive quality of Eretz Yisrael. Or is it the other way around? There's a negative quality to Chutz La'aretz. There's something inherently wrong with being outside of Eretz Yisrael, which that disqualifies whatever it is, or that does not allow us to perform the mitzvah. And it's this issue, this negative issue with Chutz La'aretz, which is the problem. And automatically, in Eretz Yisrael, where you don't have that problem, the mitzvah can be performed, or the halacha can be carried out. So I'm going to give you now 3 examples of how he applies this. First example is from the concept of the Shtei Halechem, the halach of Shtei Halechem. So the Shtei Halechem was a korban, a sacrifice that was brought on Shavuos in the Beis HaMikdash. It consisted of 2 loaves of bread that were actually baked chametz. Usually the bread, korbanos in the Beis HaMikdash, were baked as matzah. The Shtei Halechem is one of the exceptions. It was baked as chametz. And it came from the new crop of that year. And the pasuk says about the Shtei Halechem, "Mimoshveiseichem taviyu lechem tenufa." From your dwellings you should bring this bread of waving. So the Mishnah in Menachos, Perek Ches, Mishnah Aleph, Daf Pei Gimel, Amud Beis, the Mishnah tells us that in general, when it comes to all communal sacrifices, you may bring them from wheat that grew in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, or in Chutz La'aretz. You can even take wheat that grew outside of Israel. But there is 2 exceptions. There's 2 korbanos, 2 korbanos of wheat, 2 bread korbanos that can only be brought using wheat that grew in Eretz Yisrael. And that is the Shtei Halechem, these 2 loaves that were brought on Shavuos, and the other one is the korban omer, which we're not discussing for right now. So I have this requirement that the Shtei Halechem, these 2 loaves that are brought on Shavuos, must be made from wheat that grew in Eretz Yisrael. If I take wheat that grew outside of Israel, Chutz La'aretz, that wheat is pasul, is disqualified for being used in the Shtei Halechem. So now asks the Harogotchover this Chiyuv versus Shlilah type of question. He says, what's really at the root of this halacha? Is the root of the halacha that for the Shtei Halechem we require the positive quality of Eretz Yisrael? There's something special and holy and positive about Eretz Yisrael which is required for the Shtei Halechem, and that's why it has to come from Eretz Yisrael. And if you bring it from Chutz La'aretz, you're lacking this positive quality, so it's no good. So is that the point of the halacha, or is it the other way around? There's an inherent flaw, there's a negative quality to Chutz La'aretz, which disqualifies the wheat for the Shtei Halechem. So automatically, if you bring the wheat from Chutz La'aretz, it's disqualified because there's something wrong with it. And if it comes from Eretz Yisrael, there you will not have the issue with Chutz La'aretz. You won't have the flaw that exists outside of Eretz Yisrael. So the wheat comes from Eretz Yisrael, and then it's good. So that's his question. So you're going to ask, okay, but what does it make a difference? I mean, at the end of the day, l'may nafka mina. The wheat has to come from Eretz Yisrael, and if it comes from Chutz La'aretz, it's no good. So what does it matter? So he says, no, I'll show you. There's a Gemara in Menachos, Daf Samach Tes Amud Beis, where the Gemara, it's a kind of a strange Gemara, but this is a Gemara. And the Gemara there says as follows: Boy Rab Zeira. Rab Zeira asked the following question: Chitin sheyordu ba'ovim mahu. Chitim, wheat that descended from the clouds. What is the din about using this wheat for korbanos? Wheat that descended from the clouds, can you use it for a korban? So there's actually a machlokes between Rashi and Tosfos here, how to understand this scenario of wheat descending from the clouds. We're going to stick with Tosfos' explanation. Tosfos says we're talking about a miraculous event. You know, somehow there was a miraculous event, a complete miracle, and It rained wheat. So now that it rained wheat by miracle, and you have this wheat that descended from the clouds, can you use this wheat for a korban? So the Gemara asks, well, what's your question? If you're asking about a regular korban mincha, a regular korban made out of wheat, what's the problem? That wheat can come from anywhere. So what's the issue? So the Gemara says, no, I'm asking this question specifically about the shtei halechem, these two loaves. Why? Because it says, but by the shtei halechem, it has to come mimosh v'seichem. It has to come from your dwellings. It has to come from in Eretz Yisrael. So does that mean, says the Gemara, mimosh v'seichem amar achmana lafuke dechutza la'aretz? Did the Torah come to say mimosh v'seichem to exclude chutz la'aretz? That chutz la'aretz is possible. But you cannot bring the wheat from chutz la'aretz. Avol da'avim shaper dami. But if it came from the heavens, that's fine, because heavens is not chutz la'aretz. Or, says the Gemara, maybe it means mimosh v'seichem dafke. It means specifically from Eretz Yisrael, and the clouds are not Eretz Yisrael, so the wheat is no good for the shtei halechem. So, what's the din about this wheat? And then the Gemara asks, well, does this ever happen that we have to ask the question? And the Gemara says, yes, there was a story where a certain Arab woke up in the morning to find a layer of wheat in his field that had descended from the heavens. So apparently this case actually happened. So says the Harogotchover, what's the Gemara's question here? The Gemara's question here is precisely what we discussed before. The requirement of bringing the wheat from chutz la'aretz, from Eretz Yisrael, what is that all about? Do we need the positive quality of Eretz Yisrael? Or are we just trying to avoid the negative quality of chutz la'aretz? If we require the positive quality of Eretz Yisrael for the shtei halechem, for the two loaves, then clearly if it came from the clouds, it would be no good, because we do not have the positive quality of Eretz Yisrael that we need for the shtei halechem. But if the point of the halacha was that we're just trying to avoid the negative quality of chutz la'aretz, there's a flaw inherent in chutz la'aretz which disqualifies the wheat. So if it came from the clouds, then we don't have that negative quality. We don't have the flaw of chutz la'aretz because it came from the clouds. So it may not be from Eretz Yisrael, but so what? So long as we don't have the flaw of chutz la'aretz, we're good. So in that case, you can use this wheat that descended from the clouds for the korban. So that would be the practical application of this question. If you have wheat that comes neither from Eretz Yisrael, neither from chutz la'aretz, from a third, middle location, in between location, in this case the clouds, is it good or no good? And that depends on this question. If the requirement of Eretz Yisrael is about having the positive quality of Eretz Yisrael, or it's about avoiding the negative quality of chutz la'aretz. So that's one example. Another example is about the korban omer. We discussed before that the korban omer also requires that the barley come from Eretz Yisrael. What's the korban omer? This is on the second day of Pesach, Tez Zayin Nisan. They would bring a korban mincha, a grain offering in the Beis HaMikdash from barley. It came from the new crop. And that's what allowed all of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael to begin eating from the new crop. It's called the korban omer. So the korban omer was made out of barley, and it also had to come from barley that grew in Eretz Yisrael. If the barley came from chutz la'aretz, then you couldn't use it for the korban omer. So here we have the same question. Is the point here that you need the positive quality of Eretz Yisrael, or that we need to avoid the negative quality of chutz la'aretz? So the Harogotchover again points to a machlokes, very interesting machlokes between Rashi and the Ran, Rabbeinu Nissim. He says Rashi in Sanhedrin Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis says that you are allowed to bring the korban omer from barley that grew in Eiver HaYarden. Eiver HaYarden means the other side of the Jordan. It wasn't really part of Eretz Yisrael proper, but that was where the tribes of Reuven and Gad asked Moshe Rabbeinu to have land there. They settled there. It was the land of Sichon v'Oig that was conquered in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, and the 2.5 Shvatim dwelled in Eiver HaYarden. So it wasn't part of Eretz Yisrael proper, but it was somewhat part of Eretz Yisrael. So Rashi says in Sanhedrin Daf Aleph Amud Beis that the barley which grew in Eiver HaYarden, in this territory of Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, you can use for the Korban Omer. You could. But the Ran in the Dorim Chav Beis Amud Aleph says no, that Eiver HaYarden lo niskad shel avos Omer. That the Eiver HaYarden, the other side of the Yarden, was not sanctified for the bringing of the Omer. That barley which grew in Eiver HaYarden is pasul, is disqualified for being used in the Shtei Halachim. So says the Harogotchover, this is the machlokes. Eiver HaYarden, the other side of the Yarden, is a unique piece of land because it doesn't have the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, it doesn't have the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael because it's not Eretz Yisrael proper, but at the same time it doesn't have the status of Chutz La'aretz either. It's not considered outside of Eretz Yisrael because it was inhabited by the Jews in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu as part of their inheriting of Eretz Yisrael. So it's this piece of land that's in between. It's not Eretz Yisrael proper, but it's not Chutz La'aretz either. So this is the machlokes between Rashi and the Ran. According to Rashi, the halacha that says we have to bring the Korban Omer only from Eretz Yisrael isn't because we need the positive quality of Eretz Yisrael. It's because we cannot have the negative quality of Chutz La'aretz. The negative quality of Chutz La'aretz is going to create a problem for the Korban Omer. So if the Korban Omer, if the barley grew in Chutz La'aretz, you cannot use it for the Korban Omer because it has a flaw. Well, if that's the case, then if it grew in Eiver HaYarden, which does not have the status of Chutz La'aretz, it doesn't have the negative flaw, the negative quality of Chutz La'aretz, in that case it's fine to bring for the Korban Omer. So that's Rashi's opinion. You can bring the Korban Omer from barley which grew in Eiver HaYarden. But the Ran says no. The point of getting the Omer from Eretz Yisrael is not about avoiding the negative quality of Chutz La'aretz. It's because we require the positive quality of Eretz Yisrael. There's something about the Kedusha, the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, which is a necessity and is required for the Korban Omer. So if that's the case, if the barley grew in Chutz La'aretz, true, if the barley grew in Eiver HaYarden on the other side of the Yarden, true, it's not Chutz La'aretz, but it's not Eretz Yisrael either. Eiver HaYarden doesn't have the positive qualities of Eretz Yisrael. And if that's the case, barley which grew there is not going to be good for the bringing of the Omer. So here again I see the same machlokes, the same question about the Korban Omer. Is it that we require the positive quality of Eretz Yisrael, or that we're avoiding the negative quality of Chutz La'aretz? Let's take one more example about Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz again. This one is very, very interesting. And here the Harogotchover compares the mitzvah of challah to the mitzvah of meiser. So what's the mitzvah of challah? When you make bread and you make dough, you have to separate a piece of the bread, piece of the challah, and give it to a kohen. And we still do it nowadays, midrabanan. When we make challah or bread, we have to separate a piece, we make a bracha, lahafrish challah min ha'isa, and we burn it. But in the olden days, you take this piece of challah, this piece of dough, and give it to a kohen. So that's the mitzvah of challah. Then we have the mitzvah of meiser, that whatever grows in your fields, you have to give 10% to a Levi. That's called meiser rishon. And then there's also meiser sheni, which is a second meiser, a second 10% that you take, that you have to bring up to Yerushalayim and eat there. The owner himself can eat it, but he has to eat it in Yerushalayim. So we have this is the halach of meiser. So we find a very interesting difference between challah and meiser. When it comes to challah, the pasuk says, "B'vayachem el ha'aretz." When you come into the land, then the mitzvah of challah kicks in. And Rashi brings from the Sifri that the mitzvah began immediately as soon as they entered the land. As soon as the Yidden crossed the river and they entered Eretz Yisrael, right away the mitzvah of challah kicked in, and from that moment when they made bread, they were required to separate challah. But the mitzvah of meiser, we know, only began 14 years later, what's called la'achar Yerusha v'yeshiva. Only after they finished, it took them 7 years to fight the wars, and then another 7 years to finish settling and dividing up the land. So it took 14 years to be fully settled in the land. So the mitzvah of meiser only kicked in 14 years later, once the land was conquered and settled, then the mitzvah of meiser started. So asks the Harogotchover why? Why does challah begin, the mitzvah of challah kick in right away, day one, and the mitzvah of Meiser only after the conquering and the settling. And he says, because it comes back to the same point. Challah, wheat that grew in Chutz La'aretz, dough that was made in Chutz La'aretz, is potter from Meiser. It's potter from Challah. We don't need to take Challah from bread that's made in Chutz La'aretz, min ha-Torah, from the Torah. Likewise, Meiser, things that grow in Chutz La'aretz are not chayiv, we're not obligated to take Meiser. These are both mitzvahs, Challah and Meiser, which only apply to stuff that grows in Eretz Yisrael. So here again, we have to ask this same question. Is the point here that the Eretz Yisrael creates the Chiyuv, creates the obligation? The fact that it grew in Eretz Yisrael, that creates the obligation to take Challah or to take Meiser. Is the positive quality of Eretz Yisrael creating the obligation? And automatically, if it was in Chutz La'aretz, so no obligation was created because you're in Chutz La'aretz. Or is the point the other way around? It's not that Eretz Yisrael creates the obligation, it's that Chutz La'aretz creates the exemption. Chutz La'aretz, again, the negative side, the flaw of Chutz La'aretz is such that it suppresses the obligation. It creates this exemption of taking Challah, taking Meiser. Chutz La'aretz does not allow you to do the mitzvah. And automatically, if you're in Eretz Yisrael, you don't have that negative flaw, that problem, so you take Challah and Meiser. So this is the difference between Challah and Meiser. By Challah, he wants to say, Challah, it's not that the positive quality of Eretz Yisrael creates the obligation. It's by Challah, it's that Chutz La'aretz creates the exemption. Chutz La'aretz causes, the negative quality of Chutz La'aretz causes the inability to perform the mitzvah of Challah. So therefore it's understood. The moment they entered Eretz Yisrael, even before they fought the wars and conquered the land and settled the land, the moment they crossed the border into Eretz Yisrael, they became chayav in Challah. They became obligated to take Challah. Because, again, you don't need the positive quality of Eretz Yisrael to create the obligation. By Challah, it was all along the negative aspect of Chutz La'aretz getting in the way. Once you cross the border and you're no longer in Chutz La'aretz, the mitzvah of Challah kicks in. But Meiser is the other way. By Meiser, it's not that the negative quality of Chutz La'aretz gets in the way. By Meiser, we require the positive side of Eretz Yisrael to create the obligation. When did Eretz Yisrael attain its full status of Eretz Yisrael with all of the holiness? Only after the 14 years of conquering and settling. So the status of Eretz Yisrael as the Holy Land, with all of its positive qualities, that only began 14 years later. Since Meiser requires the positive quality of Eretz Yisrael to create the obligation, so that only began after the 14 years of conquering and settling. So again, we just saw that this question of whether it's the positive side of Eretz Yisrael or the negative side of Chutz La'aretz which creates the din is going to be different depending on what it is. By Challah, it was the negative side of Chutz La'aretz getting in the way, and by Meiser, the positive side of Eretz Yisrael, which creates the obligation. Okay, let's move on now to another completely different example, not about Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz, but a different area of halacha, and that is when it comes to performing the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. Who is allowed to serve in the Beis HaMikdash? Who can bring karbanos, bring sacrifices, and light the menorah, and bring the ketoras, the incense? Who can work in the Beis HaMikdash? Only a kohen. A non-kohen, which is called a zor, a foreigner, stranger, is called a zor. A zor, which means a non-kohen, is not allowed to do the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. And if a zor did the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash, besides for his own punishment, which is misa b'dei shamayim, which is that he's put to death in the hands of heaven, the avodah which he did is disqualified. The avodah is possible. So once again, we can ask the same question, because we have here this double-sided halacha. The avodah should be done, must be done by a kohen. It's only kosher when done by a kohen. If done by a zor, it is possible. So what's the point here? What's the main point? Is the main point that we require the positive aspects, the positive qualities of kahuna, of being a kohen? Is that the point? And automatically a zor who doesn't have that is possible? Or is the point the other way around? The negative qualities of a zor, the flaws of the zor, get in the way, cause a problem. and automatically a kohen who doesn't have that problem, he's able to serve. So this is the two ways of looking at it. So again, what's the nafkamina? What does it matter? So here the Harogotchover points us to what he thinks is a machlokes between the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, and Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael. He says in Maseches Zvachim, Daf Yudalad Amud Beis, there is a halacha stated by Ula. And Ula is talking about the avodah called halacha. Halacha means transporting the blood from the place where the korban was shechted. The animal was slaughtered in the azara, in its location. The kohanim had to receive the blood from the shechted animal in some kind of a vessel. And then they had to bring the blood to the mizbeach and sprinkle it on the mizbeach. So the avodah of transporting the blood from the animal to the mizbeach is called halacha, carrying the blood. So in Zvachim Yudalad Amud Beis, Ula says that if a zor, a non-kohen, performs the avodah of halacha, he carries the blood, then it's possible. Which means even if the kohen shechted and the kohen received the blood, and another kohen is going to sprinkle the blood, all the non-kohen did was just transport the blood from here to there, that's possible, and it invalidates the entire procedure. That's one statement by Ula. Then, one blot later on Daf Tezvav, Ula says another halacha. And he says, halacha shaloi beregel psula. If halacha was performed but not on foot, it's also possible. So the example given there is if a bunch of kohanim lined up, and one kohen, took the blood from the animal and he passed it to the next kohen, and passed to the next kohen, and passed to the next kohen, but there was no movement on foot of somebody transporting the blood, that's also possible. Because halacha, the act of transporting, has to be done on foot. And in fact, even though by the Korban Pesach, this process of a line of kohanim passing the cup to each other is described, so the Gemara actually says that what happened was each kohen would take a step. They wouldn't just stand, in one place and only pass the cup. They would actually also take a step, according to Ula, because the halacha has to be performed by foot as well. So that's two halachas said by Ula, that a zor, a non-kohen, cannot do the halacha, and number two, the halacha must be performed on foot. You cannot just pass it along. So on this second halacha, the Gemara asks a question. Again, the fact that halacha must be done by foot, so the Gemara asks a question. The Mishnah says that, let's say the kohen was receiving the blood in the cup, and then the cup of blood spilled on the floor by accident. So as long as the kohen gathered the blood back into the vessel, it's still fine. The fact that it spilled isn't a problem. He just has to gather it back into the cup, and he can continue the procedure as normal. So the Gemara says that we're going to assume that if the blood spilled on the floor, it must have somewhat trickled in the direction of the mizbeach. So the blood was now transported from the animal to the mizbeach, but it was not transported on foot. It was transported because it was spilled and it went in that direction. So if the Mishnah says that if the blood spilled and then it was collected, it's still kosher, you can continue the avodah, what does that mean? That even the halacha, even if the transportation wasn't done by foot, it's still good. So why would Ula say that halacha shaloi beregel is possible? Why would Ula say that if it was done not by foot, it's disqualified? So the Gemara answers that the case of the spill, we're talking about not that it spilled in the direction of the mizbeach, but in the opposite direction. So therefore there was no transportation towards the mizbeach. That's what the Gemara answers. So says the Harogotchover, notice something very interesting. This question that the Gemara asked from the blood spilling, the Gemara only asked it on the second halacha of Ula, that halacha has to be done by foot. But the Gemara did not ask it on the first halacha said by Ula, that a zor who does halacha is possible. Because if you think about it, we could have asked this question on that halacha as well. What did Ula say? That if a non-kohen does the halacha, it's possible. So we could have asked, well, it says in the Mishnah that if the cup spills and the blood goes on the floor, and then you gather it up, it's kosher. Now in that case, when the blood spilled, it's going to trickle towards the Mizbeach. Clearly it's not a Kohen who's taking it towards the Mizbeach. So it's being transported by a non-Kohen. Here there's no human at all, but there's no Kohen either. And yet the Mishnah says it's kosher. So why would Ula say that if it was transported by a non-Kohen, it's possible? So the Gemara could have asked that question, but it didn't. It only asked the question from the spill on the second halacha of transporting it not by foot. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, says the Harogotchover in Yuma, Perek halacha Aleph, there the Talmud Yerushalmi does bring the halacha that if a zor performs halacha, it is possible, and the Talmud Yerushalmi does ask on that from the Mishnah of the blood spilling on the floor. So he says, why is there a difference? Why does the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, not want to ask on the case of a zor doing halacha from the Mishnah of the blood spilling, but the Talmud Yerushalmi does? And he says a beautiful insight. Because they argue about the nature of the disqualification of a zor, of a non-Kohen. He says, according to the Talmud Bavli, the reason why you have to have a Kohen and why a zor, a non-Kohen, is possible is because of the negative quality of the zor. There's something inherently wrong with the zor that gets in the way of him doing the avodah. The problem is in the flaw of the zor. That's where the root of the halacha lies. The root of the din lies in the negative side, that the zor has a problem, and automatically a kohen who doesn't have that problem can do the avodah. He says, therefore, according to the Talmud Bavli, you cannot compare the case of blood spilling on the floor to the case of a zor transporting the blood. When a zor transports the blood, it's possible. Why is it possible? Because we have a zor, which is a big problem, performing the avodah. Again, the quality of a zor gets in the way. The quality of the zor creates the problem. So if the zor is doing the halacha, it's creating a problem. But if the blood spills and trickles towards the Mizbeach, so what if it wasn't done by a kohen? You don't really need the quality of a kohen. We just have to avoid the negative quality of the zor. So if the blood spilled and it trickled towards the Mizbeach, it wouldn't be a problem. Because yes, there's no kohen, but there's no zor creating the problem either. So therefore, in the perspective of the Talmud Bavli, that the issue with the zor is the negative quality of the zor. So clearly that problem doesn't exist by the blood spilling by itself, so there would be no question. So the Talmud Bavli is not going to ask a question on the case of a zor doing the halacha from the case of blood spilling. But the Talmud Yerushalmi sees it the other way. Talmud Yerushalmi says no, the issue with the zor isn't that he has a flaw, that he has